Hello, everyone. Welcome. I want to welcome everybody to the American Writers Museum and to this program, including the folks who are watching online. My name's Allison Sansoni. I'm the program director here at the museum. And I just have a couple of quick housekeeping notes before we get started. If you do not yet have a copy of tonight's book, you can get that from Seminary Co-op, our book selling partner here and online. They're in the back of the room if you're here in person. And if you're watching online, you can go to semcoop.com and get your copy of tonight's book there. If you like the kinds of programs that you're seeing from the museum, you can join as a member on our website at americanwritersmuseum.org or up at the front desk following the program. You can get free admission, discounted tickets to events, including our happy hour series, Get Lit, and a number of other advance notice of programs and exhibits and fun things like that. Thank you all for being here and for valuing the past, present, and future of American writing. This Pride Month, the AWM is highlighting the work of some of our historic writers with the Writing Queer Tour, featuring Henry Blake Fuller writing America's first published gay novel, Gertrude Stein creating community for queer writers in Paris, and Polly Murray writing about their gender identity in the 1930s. We're thrilled tonight to kick off our Pride Month programming with Zachary Zane, author of Boyslut, a Memoir and a Manifesto. He currently has 2 columns, Sexplain-It, the sex and relationship advice column at Men's Health, and Navigating Non-Monogamy at Cosmo. He's also the founder and editor-in-chief of the Boyslut zine, which publishes real sex stories from around the world. His work on sexuality and relationships has been published in the New York Times, Rolling Stone, the Washington Post, GQ, Out, and many other places. Please join me in welcoming Zach. Thanks so much for joining us here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm super excited.
So we've got a few questions for you that I wanted to ask you, and I know our audience is going to have questions as well. But before we get started with our conversation, I understand that you had something from the book that you wanted to read to us.
Sure. I was just going to read a little section of the book. It's actually just the first chapter, or I guess the first part of the first chapter here. And so chapter 1, and the title is, Am I a Sex-Obsessed Pervert? One of my first memories is imagining my childhood therapist naked. Mark was handsome, the pinnacle of daddy, late 30s, solid build, scruffy. He wore floral printed shirts that were just a small step above Hawaiian. He had a warm, friendly demeanor, more so than most therapists, perhaps because he worked with children. I suffered from severe obsessive-compulsive disorder, which was why my mom had sought Mark out. His office was cluttered with bright, colorful pictures of cartoon animals sporting supportive phrases like a penguin who beamed, "You can do anything." For the last 20 minutes of each session, we always played a game together. At first it was Candyland, but by the time I left his practice, I was beating him at chess. He usually sat cross-legged, for which I was grateful. Uncrossing his legs meant I would immediately and involuntarily imagine his penis flanked by a big old pair of saggy balls. Sorry. Trying not to imagine his loins only made things worse. Don't think of his balls. Now I'm thinking of his balls. Balls, shit, why am I doing this? What's wrong with me? Balls, I'm so messed up. Deep breath, balls. Now they're closer? I'm such a sicko. Balls, I'm disgusting. Balls, why can't I stop doing this? Balls, it's because I'm a bad person. Or to put it more succinctly, balls, shame, balls, tears of shame. Up until this point, at 10 years old, I had seen only one pair of testicles other than my own, my father's. It was never on purpose, yet they always managed to peek out through his robe. To this day, 3 of my closest childhood friends have accidentally seen my father's testicles, and the verdict has always been the same. Holy fuck, dude, those are like grapefruits. After more than a dozen sessions, plagued by images of Mark's massive testicles and silver bush, I felt it was time to confess. Not only was the guilt too much for my prepubescent, grape-sized testicled soul to bear, I was also seeking absolution. That's what people with OCD do. You've probably heard that people with OCD repeatedly wash their hands, but some of us approach cleansing in other ways. We attempt to clean our minds of guilt-inducing thoughts, seeking out relief from guilt that's eating us away. We need to be told explicitly and frequently that what we're thinking is okay, and we're not a bad person for having these thoughts. I took a deep breath. I want to say something really bad, I said. That's okay. You can share anything you want here. There's never any judgment, he replied. But this is really bad, I clarified. I'm sure it's not as bad as you think. Okay, I said, confident Mark was not understanding the full gravitas of the situation. After what felt like an eternal pause, I began to stammer. I had to spit it out. I imagine people naked. A lot. His face and demeanor didn't change. He sat there, smiling, as if I hadn't just dropped a bomb. Really, like any good therapist, he was just waiting for me to elaborate. Everyone, I continued, not even people I like, just everyone. I can't stop it, even though I try. Finally, he spoke. It's okay, Zach. We all imagine people naked. That did not ease my guilt. I didn't care about what other so-called normal people did. I cared about me and my bad behavior. I mean everyone, I continued. Like old people, kids in school, everyone. I just can't stop. It was at that exact moment that Mark uncrossed his legs to reposition. Like you, I confessed. I'm imagining you naked right now. He laughed, both professional and unfazed, reiterating how I was allowed to imagine anyone naked. Anyone included him. There was nothing wrong with that. But how do I stop? I asked on the cusp of tears. It's distracting. I can't concentrate on anything else. My gaze kept darting down until I resigned myself to shutting my eyes. Focused as I was on futile attempts to keep him clothed, his response still landed. Thinking of people naked isn't bad. You'll only be able to stop thinking of people naked when you truly believe that. When that happens, your thoughts will pass just as quickly as they come. When you think of something, in this case nudity, as being bad, the thoughts and images won't pass. You dwell on them. My eyes were closed, but I imagined him repositioning his hairy grapefruits. So I'm here to tell you, Zach, that there's nothing wrong with any of your thoughts surrounding nudity. There's nothing wrong with you. I'd only realized later this was Mark's attempt to teach me coping mechanisms for intrusive thoughts caused by OCD. Talking yourself down, while extremely difficult, is a way to work through intrusive thoughts. CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, not to be confused with cock and ball torture, a common treatment for anxiety and OCD. Actually, I think both are common treatments for anxiety and OCD, is all about this. You attempt to refrain your thoughts while not getting overwhelmed by negative emotions. Eyes still closed, I nodded while taking a deep breath. When I opened them, Mark was fully dressed. Shoulders back, head held high, I left my shrink's office to where my mom was illegally parked. I felt as if I'd accomplished something. I'd no longer see a world filled with naked, flesh-colored zombies whose sole purpose was to make me feel guilty. Even my little preteen self was able to see this breakthrough as a momentous occasion. How'd it go? My mom asked as I climbed in. I looked at her, immediately imagined her naked, and said, fine. So a little bit, so the rest of that chapter, I kind of talk about how actually I grew up in a very, can you guys hear me without this?
No? They can't hear you online.
Just kidding. Okay. So I actually grew up in a very sex positive, queer affirming household. I had gay uncles on both sides of my family, but still I had so much shame around nudity, around sexuality, around homosexual and bisexual thoughts. And it was important for me to really make this point clear, because I feel like a lot of like the gay memoirs I read are like, you're kind of validated through your trauma in a way where it's like, okay, you got kicked out of your household for being gay, you had a religious experience, versus me, I actually didn't have any of those really negative experiences, but I just existed in society. And sex negativity is so insidious, it's so pervasive. So even though I had sex positive family, like I still picked up these negative messages from school, my friends, teachers, society, media. And so like kind of the overarching point of this chapter is really like, if you exist in the world today, you're going to soak up sex negative images. Perhaps unless if you live on like a poly nudist commune without social media or internet, then you're probably doing great. But as for the rest of us who live in society, we have a lot to unlearn and unpack. Kind of regardless of whatever your upbringing was, these still sex negative messages still affect you.
That was actually the first thing that I wanted to ask you about. So thank you for that and for those words that you shared with us. But who were the writers and the artists who you remember, the sort of figures who sort of influenced you positively when you first began writing and when you began writing about sex specifically?
It's funny. I wasn't one of those like kids who was like, oh, the parents went to sleep, let me like look at a flashlight and look at a book. Like, I thought reading was for nerds. I wasn't doing it. I was playing video games. And then I kind of learned after high school, and while actually just reading books for fun during college, like during summer break, that like, oh, I just hated the books they gave me in school. Like, there are actually a lot of good books, and I wish they actually taught you a love of learning and a love of reading instead of some of the stodgy, I don't know if that's the right word, but like texts that like you kind of had to read. So I kind of got to reading late, and later in life, really enjoyed reading later in life, like in college. And at the time, I remember reading, what influenced me, ironically, is now like, these straight writers who now I don't think I've read like a straight male writer in a very long time, but it was like really things with like unlikable protagonists that I found myself resonating with. I remember I read like David Foster Wallace's Interviews with Hideous Men, if you guys have read that, which is just like so brilliant and so fucked up. And I resonated with every single one of those little short stories. I'm like, am I a terrible person? Like, is that what this is? So I think that was originally the type of books that I really enjoyed reading. And then once I came out, I started reading more queer writers, I started reading more female writers, I started reading more people of color and Black writers in a way that I hadn't even registered, honestly, for me to start doing this earlier. And now kind of my writing inspirations are really like, I remember reading actually, and this is still like a shitty, a book about a shitty straight dude, but I remember liking it. It was Jay McInerney, Bright Lights, Big City. And he writes the whole book in second person. And it's really hard to justify writing in second person if you're writing a piece. I think when you're young, you're like, oh, this is so cool. You do this, you do that. But it's like, no, it gets old very quickly. There has to be a reason why you're doing it. And in this case, the guy was kind of in this dissociative, drug-fueled haze. And that's why it worked. But I remember reading it and being like, oh, you can do anything. Like, you can write an entire book in second person. And there are very few books that have done that, at least successfully. And that, weirdly, was a book that inspired me greatly. And then I'm very lucky to come from like, I don't want to say a family of writers, but there are definitely a lot of writers in my family. I wrote a novel when I was 22. I'm terrified to read that ever again. I hope it's burned somewhere. But my sister-in-law is actually Taylor Jenkins Reid. And so I was very lucky that she went page by page with me. And this was before Zoom. So this is on like Skype, being like, okay, so you have talent, but there's like 7 pages dedicated to the protagonist picking his nose. Is that needed? Does it forward the plot? I'm like, well, not everything needs to forward the plot. Like, but this, I'm like, this is about the monotony of being in a business meeting, an office meeting. And I'm like, okay. So she actually really helped me, and actually going page by page and having someone, and this was kind of before 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo and Daisy Jones and the Six. So kind of before she blew up. But I'm so lucky to have her. She really went page by page with me and kind of helped me to kind of become the writer that I am today.
So there were 2 pages of someone picking his.
Yeah, so by the end there was only 2 pages. That book, I ended up not getting an agent from that book, I can tell you that much.
Well, you just haven't found the right agent.
Exactly.
That's exactly what it is. So when you're writing, and this is the American Writers Museum, so there's going to be a lot of questions about craft, and I promise you we will get to the sex questions. It's going to happen. But first, I wanted to ask you a little bit about, not just in this book, but also in your columns and your essays and writing about sex. I want to ask you about your use of language, especially as it pertains to, the decision to describe something creatively versus using a term that might be more clinical. Tell me about sort of how you think about language and communicating to your readers.
I think one thing I like to be, I guess there are two different answers, but I think one thing, especially when writing about LGBTQ content and in this book, one thing I really don't like about kind of queers in 2023 is often how elitist we are with our language and how we use elements of like academia and queer theory in a way that I feel like isolates a lot of queer people and makes, people who potentially could be allies being like, oh, they're so far up their own ass. And so for me, I usually like to write as like simply as possible. And I actually think if it's much harder to write simply, it's easier to use that academic language, in many ways. But if you can actually convey something without these big unnecessary words, especially when you're talking about queer theory or identity in your experience, I think you're going to have a much larger impact. So I always try to write really as simply in a way that everyone can digest it and read it and learn from it. And that's specifically kind of with my columns and specifically when talking about like queer identity. And then kind of a second part of that is I like to be raunchy and vulgar and explicit. And it's not just for shock value, although some of it's slightly for shock value, but that I think wears off pretty quickly. I think a lot of what's happened, and one thing I don't like, especially when discussing bisexuality, is I feel like we've kind of somewhat neutered ourselves, like removing elements of sex to make it more palatable to kind of mainstream audiences. And, and gay people used to do this as well. And then they kind of fought back against it, being like, no, sex is a big part of our sexuality and want to include that. So for me, it's important to be graphic and explicit about sex. I want us to be able to talk about sex openly and for it to be in your face. And if you get a little bit uncomfortable with that, that's okay. You need to unpack that and figure out why you're getting uncomfortable with that. So that's in large part why I kind of write using that type of language, the more graphic language.
When you were writing this book, did you have a specific audience in mind for it?
Yes. It's funny because, I think initially in kind of like my marketing and advertising, and hopefully my editors and publicists are not watching, but like we kind of had to say like, this is a book for everyone and everyone can learn from it. And that is 100% true. Like I really do think straight people can learn from this. People from any age can learn from this. Like people, any gender, sexual orientation, anything can, but like, this is always the cliche answer, but it's like the book I wish I had when I was 16, 17. And I'm realizing that, this book is for the queers, the bisexuals, the kinksters, the faggots, the gays, the homos, that like the alternatives, like that really is who this book is for. And people have not seen themselves represented. And the hypersexual, can I include them in that? Although I just argue they're sexual. There is no hypersexuality. It's just sexual. Yeah. And really having this book for them, and really like in a way this book is like my love letter to the bi community. Like I feel like I've really, in the time that I've been writing, like the amount of bisexual visibility has gone up exponentially, which is pretty cool. When I started writing like 8 years ago, there was very little, which is why I was able to get to where I was. Like I became known as the bi guy. I was one of the first people writing bi articles for bi people. Like every other bi article that was out was like 10 things to never say to a bisexual person or 10 myths about bisexuality. It was like justifying our existence to straight and gay people. But there was no content about being like, how do I deal with internalized biphobia? How do I date while being bi? When can I consider myself bi? If I'm predominantly attracted to one gender or only see myself marrying one gender, does that still constitute bisexuality? And I started writing about bisexuality in a way that just hadn't really been done before. And again, I thought I was going to be a novelist. I did not think I was going to be writing a memoir, but then this kind of train kind of took off, and I thought I'd get off it. And I guess this is where it led me. So I guess a long way of saying this book is for bisexuals and queers. I guess that is who it's for. That was a very long answer to that, but yeah.
That's great. No, I mean, because you have so many different audiences for your work, through your columns, through your essays, through the zine, and those audiences overlap. They follow you from one place to another, but they are different ways of reaching people.
It's interesting how, so I used to be like a low-level editor at Out Magazine, and like Pride and The Advocate, they're all owned by the same people. And the amount of impact I think I've had writing my sex column at Men's Health is like exponentially greater. I get a lot of messages from like bi men, married to women in their like 40s, 50s, 60s. And excuse me one sec. But them saying like, oh, I came out to my wife as bi, I'm realizing I'm bi because of you. And often I get the messages when things turned out well. Once in a while, it's like my wife did leave me. And I'm like, biphobia is real. That's a real thing. And I'm really sorry that happened to you, but hopefully you can now find someone who loves and accepts and embraces you. But part of me kind of broke when I got that email, if I'm being honest. But these are men who would not feel comfortable going to out.com, to pride.com, right? But they do feel comfortable going to Men's Health. And so this is kind of a group of men that I think have not really been reached in any way. And a group of men that when they are closeted and angry are not treating their spouses well, they're not treating their partners well, they're not treating their colleagues well or friends well, they are unhappy. And I know it's like the phrase hurt people, but it's like that's what's happening with these closeted men, or many of these closeted men. Obviously, I'm not trying to stereotype this group. So it's really cool having this outlet at Men's Health and actually feel like I'm having a greater impact there than I've had writing for LGBT mags, which is pretty cool.
How did you make the shift from, writing these shorter pieces? You mentioned you wrote a novel to memoir. I think this is in a way almost the ideal length. Like each chapter is what I'd actually want to write. I've always been someone who's more verbose, and it's always 2,000 words down to 800 words, 3,000 words down to 1,000. Over the years of writing, I've learned to just, start at 1,200 to get it down to 800. But I love the fact, in writing this book that I have 3,000 to 5,000 words, maybe some chapters a little bit longer, but to really actually delve beyond the 101. I think that's the one thing that frustrates me in my line of work, is about how so many of the pieces I have to write are SEO pieces, which is search engine optimization, which is, I'm going to blow my brains out. But like, it's like, what are anal beads? And you can't even write a fun story on what are anal beads. You have to write it in a way that Google will prioritize it, right? So I can't even write a funny story about it. I have to hit these keywords. And so much of what people Google is 101 content. So it's very rare that I get to write a 301 piece. It's very rare that I get to write a thought piece that's 3,000 to 5,000 words. But I actually do get to now, although it's still on the shorter side, they give me like 1,500 words at the new column I got at Cosmo. And what I pitched to them for the non-monogamy column was, I'm like, I also have access to some of their traffic because I write for Men's Health and they're owned by Hearst. So I could see that they're like, their open relationship content does very well, right? But I had said to them, I was like, I've noticed that the type of articles that are out right now, not just in Cosmo, but everywhere, is just how to open up your relationship and how to navigate jealousy. I've been polyamorous for almost a decade. I don't really struggle with jealousy that much anymore. If I do, I talk about it with my partner. It's very easily resolvable. I'm not opening up my relationship. I've been doing this for 8 years. I still have 10 million other problems I'm struggling with in my polyamorous relationship, and I'm not seeing it written about at all. So I would love to write some like different content than what we're seeing. And Cosmo gave me an opportunity, and which I'm really grateful for. And the column, it's monthly, and I just finished the 4th one this morning.
has been really cool to be able to delve into these issues that I just have not seen anywhere else within polyamory. It's almost like I had a column for bi.org years ago, and I think I had maybe 100 the columns I wrote for them. And by the end, both me and the editor, I'm like, I am out of content. Like I don't know what else to do. Like I'm losing my mind. She's like, I'm fine with this leaving, and or this ending. And I don't want to say I've written everything there is to write about bisexuality. Of course, that is not true, but I feel like I've written a lot about that. And now giving the opportunity to kind of write this, to do what I did for bisexuality, almost for polyamory in a way, to write some more advanced content for polyamorous people, and people who are not just new to it. Yeah.
Yeah. How do you, so you're in all of your writing, you're connecting with readers on these really intimate topics, and you're sharing things about yourself to connect with them. How do you decide what you want to share and not share?
So you'll see in this book, I usually don't write poorly about other people. That's not really the point of this book, or of just my writing in general. I have fucked up enough times in my life on my own that I can talk about the growth that I have from my own experience and what I learned from my own experiences. So I really try hard to not write about other people negatively. And specifically for this book, everything kind of had to tie into the overarching narrative of overcoming sexual shame and embracing my bisexuality. So while I maybe had some fun, ridiculous sex stories that would have been fun and silly to write about, if it didn't kind of go to the overarching narrative, I wouldn't include it.
So nothing that, reflects poorly on any partners or anyone that you write
No,
about.
And I could write tomes on my partner's behavior, but that's not past partners' behaviors. But that's not what it's about. Again, this book is about me. It's not about my partners. And sometimes your partners have done something to you in a way that influences you. But even when I write about that, I really try to write in a way that's not negative of them.
Throughout this process, did you find yourself having a hard time maintaining compassion for your younger self?
Yes. What a great question. Thank you. I haven't gotten that yet. It was hard looking at my past experiences and seeing how I hurt people. And of course, that wasn't my intent. Obviously you're 22, you're dating, you're going to hurt people, you know what I mean? But I've made a lot of mistakes in my life. And while it was never my intent to hurt people, it was never done maliciously, you still hurt people. And I think that was really challenging for me to write about it. And even now with this Cosmo column, which I pitched myself, and the format of it is, it's a mistake I've made in my non-monogamous journey and what I've learned from all the mistakes I've made. So I'm looking back on all these times I've treated partners not ideally, and it has been challenging. And I'm going to unpack this with my therapist at the next session. But great question. No, it was challenging though. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
Yeah. What, so as you're continuing your work in this space, how has sex writing changed from the start of your career to now?
Ooh, how is sex writing changed? I think, we're starting to see different elements of sex spoken about. Again, just like bisexuality and polyamory, all of these things. I definitely am more explicit and graphic now, and I think that's on purpose. I think I used to be a little bit more timid when writing about sex and worried that, I might not get other writing jobs for it. Even though I was a sex writer, which is kind of wild, but still it's I'm a sex columnist, and still a lot of big sex columnists, they don't really talk too much about their personal life. They actually keep it quite separate. And a part of me almost wishes I've done that. I feel like I've invested too much and I've shared too much in a way, but it also is a way that I feel like the reader can resonate with me. But I think one thing I find interesting in writing about and what's changing, and I always enjoy writing about this, is kind of generational differences of sex. And like I've spoken about this in terms of like attending swinger sex parties where the average age is 55, and then going to a sex party where the average age is 25 or 30, and just like the different levels of consent in these different spaces, what's considered norms in these spaces, how, you know, social media is impacting, you know, millennials and Gen Z's relationship with sex. So I think I'm always interested, in kind of what the next generation is doing, how technology is intersecting with it, how just general societal norms are changing over time. I think is always an interesting thing to look at.
I was going to ask about the generational differences that you're seeing in, you know, in your readership and the people that write in with questions and the response to your work, because I think it's easy to make a case one way or the other that we are more liberated or less liberated than we've ever been. And so I was curious what your thoughts are on that.
I don't know. I feel like in millennials, I was talking about this with my friends recently, but it's like, I feel like millennials were very open sexually, and then we've seen a slight pushback from Gen Z, but I don't even know if this is true or if this is just because I've read a few pieces that are now telling me this and they're claiming it's a trend, but I'm like, is this actually a trend? I feel like I need to talk to more people about it. The Gen Z people I know in my community are extremely sex positive. So I'm not sure exactly how to answer that question, because I feel like everything I read is slightly different, and every question that comes in, I have very, I don't want to say enlightened or woke, but very, you know, educated and sex positive people over the age of 50, 60 reaching out, and then some seemingly very sex negative, you know, 23-year-olds who are just like, I'm like, okay, so casual sex hasn't been good for you. You don't have to have it. That's fine. You can have a serious romantic relationship. I don't feel like I'm forcing that on you. Yet you're now saying that all casual sex are hurting women's self-esteem. And I'm like, that's not true. I can promise you that much. Like, that's just factually not true. So, yeah, it's a little bit all over the place. I'm not exactly sure.
And trend reporting too can be, is this an actual trend or is it just somebody's vibes?
Yeah, I mean, I especially know this as someone who is a journalist, where it's like, if I wanted to pitch this and with my bylines and profile, I could write a piece on how Gen Z is the least sex positive generation or the most sex positive generation. Exactly. I could literally write or pitch either right now to a major outlet, and both would get published, or either would get published. Yeah.
The negative in the Wall Street Journal and the positive,
exactly.
Maybe, Men's Health or Cosmo.
There we go.
Yeah. What, who are some of the writers who are, you know, besides yourself, of course, who are doing exciting work in the sex writing space?
Specifically the sex writing space. So Stoya, if you guys are like famous porn star who then writes his half of the sex column at Slate's How to Do It. And then Rich Juzwiak, who's the other half of How to Do It at Slate. That's probably my favorite sex column. And I shouldn't say that because I have literally my own sex columns. But I really love the stuff that they do. It's so succinct and so honest, and like not just like, oh, communicate with your partner, or like coming out is hard and you have to decide if that decision's right for you. I respect columnists that have an opinion, even if I disagree with it. It's just like, I want you to fucking say something. So I think they're doing great work. Sophie St. Thomas, who has her book out called Sex Witch, which is actually a fun thing of just like sex magic and stuff like that as well. And she writes some fun stuff. She has a column on Ask Men, which was Never How I Ever, which is a monthly column where she interviews someone who's doing something for the first time. Who else do I like? Gigi Engel is great. She has a book called All the Fucking Mistakes. I've been cursing this whole time. I don't know why suddenly.
Don't stop now.
Suddenly. She has a book called All the Fucking Mistakes. And then I'm going to get like the subtitle wrong, but it's like Life Lessons I've Learned on Life, Sex, and Love or something like that. That's a great book. I'm trying to think of like new sex people who are coming out as well. I mean, that was a little bit of a bunch. I mean, that was a bunch of people too. Was there anything? Yeah, I guess I'll start with them. Yeah,
that's a very good to be read pile, and I can see people adding to their Goodreads list as we sit here. But before we get to audience questions, and I just folks, if you do have questions, if you could step up to the microphone in the middle of the room, that's just so folks it's so we can hear you, but it's also so folks who are following along online can hear your question.
Oh, and take some photos. I have to show my mom and grandma. Like we have to take some few photos. So if anyone has, and then I'll ask for them
prove that
after.
you were here.
That I was here. I'm speaking at a museum for Boyslut. Yes, at a museum for the book Boyslut. Yes, correct.
But for folks who are watching along online, if you could also type your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, we might read those out as well. But before we get to that, I just wanted to ask you one last question, which is, at a time of violent pushback against writing on queer topics and any number of other things, how important is it for kids, especially kids who want to explore queer sexuality or identity, to have the kinds of positive role models that we talked about at the beginning of our conversation?
I mean, of course, the answer is it's so necessary. And again, this is not a kid's book. I don't know who has read it and who has not read it. And I remember talking to my publisher. I'm like, if we marketed it as YA, it will get banned and I will be a New York Times bestseller. He's like, we cannot do that. I'm like, okay. I was just throwing out ideas. Didn't realize there were bad ones in this room.
It's a marketing strategy.
It's a marketing strategy. But no, I mean, I think depending on how, I remember someone asked me on Instagram being like, hey, so I have LGBT teens. I was a teacher, 17, 18, 19. Is this appropriate for them? And I kind of responded, this is a book that I wish I had at 16 or 17. However, that said, I recommend you read it yourself first and you make that decision, because parts of it are about drug use, some pretty intense kinks, and just an overall explicit. That's a part of it. But no, right now, more than ever, as we're trying to ban just literature, just basic education, it's making sure that always LGBTQ teens, and also just teens in general, women, men, everyone, straight, it doesn't matter. Just kids in general have accurate information and have positive role models and understand that just they are not alone. I think that's one thing that was kind of the best thing that happened to me when I realized, I remember for so long, especially with my bisexuality, I didn't know a single other out bi guy, and every guy in college who came out as bi shortly came out as gay afterwards. And while I am egocentric, I'm not delusional. I was like, I can't be the only bi guy in the world. And I remember once, through therapy, and I started embracing this, I started talking about my bisexuality, learning that, oh shit, there are bi people absolutely everywhere, and this is incredible. And that feeling I kind of described in the book, where I was like, the biggest revelation was realizing that I'm not special. But what I mean by not special is that I'm not alone. And so I really hope that LGBTQ teens and teens just across the globe know that they're not alone and can find elements of community, even though books are being banned. And that's one of those things where it's social media and Twitter and TikTok are the fucking worst and a hellscape. At the same time, it can actually foster community, and hopefully that they're using it for those purposes would be incredible.
Do we have questions from our audience? Please step up to the mic.
I had a question. In this time when magazines are pretty much, they don't come in the mail any longer. Many of my friends, even in my generation, and I'm 75, are not reading books so much. How many copies do you expect to sell? Or what kind of book sales do you envision for this type of book?
God, the thing is, when I talk to my team about this, they do not want to give me a number. And I understand why. As you read from this book, I'm neurotic and obsessive. And so if I don't hit the number, I'm going to be upset. So my agent, my publisher, no one will give you an accurate number as to what constitutes a success. I realize, I was hoping this book, of course, in my mind, I'm like, this is going to be a New York Times bestseller. That's not how a first-time author, it's very rarely a New York Times bestseller unless if they're already a huge celebrity. But in terms of sales, the only thing I can hope for is kind of slow and steady growth, where I really hope that people read it, they like it. The feedback I've been receiving has been overwhelmingly positive. Someone today messaged me something so sweet, and then afterwards was like, your book helped me more than my past year of therapy. And I was like, you should get a new therapist. But it was, but like, so really, I think word of mouth will be the key thing. And I think this will be, I'll put it this way, a grower and not a shower, is what it's going to be. But already, in terms of book sales, at least my publisher is happy. I was not, but I don't think I was going to be. I think I was setting myself up for failure a little bit. But yeah, so please buy as many copies, and if you like it, tell your friends. If you don't like it, I don't care. Tell your friends. Tell them something. Tell them to buy it. But yeah.
The business of this sort of thing is a whole other creature,
it's
right?
So I still haven't been able to get like an accurate number of how many books I've sold even. It just like, which is kind of, it's been a month out, like just from hard copies, and then also I don't know, ebooks, and then Audible, and then international sales. So I actually don't even really know how much I've sold. And I was just at my college reunion, and we did like an author meet and greet, and I was talking to the other authors there, and many of them were New York Times bestsellers, and they're like, still, I don't know how many books I've sold for like 5 months. Like there really is just so many factors that go into it. But if this book sold, by the end of the year, if it sells 5,000 copies, I'll be ecstatic. You know what I mean? Like that would be a great number.
Yeah. Did you have a question?
Hi. I really resonated with most, if not all, of your book. I really appreciated getting to read it.
Thank you.
And particularly a lot of the parts about growing up with very liberal parents. I grew up in the Bay Area. Both my parents have come out as bi in the last 2 years, actually.
I love that.
Which is wild. I feel like a trendsetter in that way. I was the first. And I'm wondering how your relationship with your parents and how you talk about sex and sexuality with your parents has changed since you started being more open and honest with yourself about sex and sexuality.
Yeah. That's a great question. I feel like I've almost evolved and grown more open with myself over time, and then they've been a part of that journey with me. I feel like if it went from like 0 to 100, like if I started being like, oh, I'm bi, and then they read some of the stuff I wrote in my zines, they'd be like, what the fuck? So I think I kind of took them along this journey with them. Of course, with me, of course, I still have boundaries, you know what I mean? And now, like, we know my parents don't like Google my name, and they respect me for that. If I write a piece, in New York Times, Rolling Stone, something like that, that's something that they can read, I will just send it to them. With this book, my dad, so far I've allowed my dad to read the book. I'm not sure if I want my mom to read the book. Although I did have her actually, before the book came out, I had her read the first chapter, which included her, just to be like, hey, do you feel comfortable with what I'm sharing about you? And if not, please let me know, because there was some personal information about her. And again, I don't usually share personal information about other people, but in this case, it impacted me. And she's like, no, I'm actually okay with this. But I think over time, they've become more sex positive. We have more conversations about this. They also now kind of do their own research and educate themselves in a way too. I think they have an interest in, sex positivity in a way that they probably wouldn't have if it wasn't for me. So now if they if they're online and they say something sex positive or bisexual or polyamorous, they're actually going to read it. So it's not just me having these conversations with them. They're actually learning from the rest of the world too.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Are they sending you content?
Oh my God. They love sending me content, especially and good for them when it's something poorly written in like a mainstream magazine. They're like, you could have done this better. And I'm like, I think I could have done this better. Thank you. They're like, why aren't you doing this? I'm like, okay, thank you. But yeah.
Do we have any other questions?
I have one question. I'm sorry, I have not read your book yet, but I will as soon as I buy it. So forgive me if you already talked about this. As a fellow OCD, sufferer, I don't know. I'm curious how that impacted your coming out journey. Like, question of sexuality, I know it can be easy to get in your own head and like loops of like trying to figure out the right answer, who you are. So I'd love to hear more about that, or how you navigate it now.
Yeah, so it was really challenging during my coming out process. And I do talk about this a little in the book, but there's something that used to be called HOCD, homosexual OCD. They've now changed it to be SO OCD, sexual orientation OCD. So one of the common obsessions that people with OCD have is thinking they are gay when they are not, actually when they are not gay. And the same way where like, if you go on Reddit and you kind of see some of the OCD stuff where like someone would be like, I'm so worried that I'm going to stab my daughter. And like, I love my daughter. I would do nothing to hurt my daughter, but I'm just like afraid it just becomes this obsession. But with like SO OCD, specifically these, you know, like give the example of a man who has it, like they might leave their wife and kids and like ruin and upend their life, and they're not gay. This is just a symptom of their OCD. So in that regards, it's really, really challenging because like I had a psychiatrist when I was 16, and I asked him, I was like, hey, I think I might be gay. And he goes, like, do you like women? I'm like, yes, I do like women. He's like, well, then you're not gay. I'm like, that makes sense. I'm like, what fair enough. I'm like, but could I be bisexual? And he actually said, oh, bisexuality doesn't exist in men. And he just said that point blank. And the reason why was at that time, I did the math, it was in 2006, right before that big Northwestern study came out that the New York Times wrote up, that was like, they literally like looked at arousal patterns, meaning that it was just like people guys getting erect to like various porn with men and women. And it concluded definitively, because some guys didn't get boners, that like bisexuality wasn't real. It was absolutely one of the worst studies. And then they tried to even replicate that study, and then they couldn't even replicate it. So I understood that was part of why, like, that study had just come out. Also, he just thought this was an OCD loop. So I think it's really important for like therapists and psychiatrists in particular to be like, okay, like, yes, this could be an OCD loop or an OCD obsession. However, let's actually take a little bit of moment to unpack that. And I wish that he had done that, because I feel like often, and I'm not a therapist, so I can't exactly speak to this, but like if you ask people with SOCD, it seems like what are you attracted about in men, they don't really have an answer to that. Versus like, oh, I have an answer. Like I know what I like. Cum gutters. No, but so I think there needs to be a way to kind of, for therapists to help, and then for yourself to help and evaluate, being like, okay, like, is there a way that I can differentiate between this loop and actual attraction? I also think it can be potentially helpful, and this is ironic coming from someone who loves the label bisexual so much and has found this community, and it brings me such a strong sense of identity. But I really wished when I started hooking up with people, I didn't feel as compelled to label myself. I feel like my obsession with a label really took me out of the moment. So I'd be like, oh, I'm hooking up with a dude, and I couldn't even focus on anything. I'd be like, this is making me gay. Am I bi? Am I gay? Am I liking this? Am I not liking this? Like, and just freaking the fuck out, where I like wish I could just be like, okay, let's just see what this is. And if I decide I didn't enjoy this, then I'm still 100% straight. Yeah. So I think in the beginning, potentially exploring without a focus on labels. And then once you actually are kind of setting a little bit and you see what you keep coming back to, I think that was a big one for me too, where like I was hooking up with guys for like 5 years while blackout. And still being like, oh, I'm exploring, and I keep waking up and I see that I jacked off to gay porn the night before, and that's a little weird, but we're gonna avoid that for now. But I remember I had my brother who was like sitting with him. I remember this was at the El Torito on Van Nuys in Los Angeles in the Valley. And he goes, Zach, you know, we were all, I've told our brothers, and he's like, you know, we've all had gay rumors about us for forever. We're all a little bit more effeminate and in touch with our feelings. You know, I hooked up with a few guys in college, realized it wasn't for me. I think Nico maybe did too, or maybe made out with a dude. You've been doing it for 5 years. Like, at what point, like, I don't think that counts as exploring anymore, right? Like, at what point is that like a stable orientation? And I was like, oh my God, I'm gonna be like on my 40th like anniversary with my husband and be like, thank you so much as you stay with me as I continue to figure out if I'm attracted to men and my sexuality, and this has been a great journey as I explore. Like, and that really like hit me like a ton of bricks, where I was like, all right, I need to figure this out, because that, like, why make that joke? That is kind of scary. Like, oh my God, I want to be able to just embrace my attractions and my love and have fulfilling romantic relationships. But that lit a little bit of a fire under my ass to be like, okay, I need to figure this out, because at this point, I think it maybe no longer counts as exploring here.
You've found your destination.
I found my destination. I mean, it's always a destination, and the sexuality grows and evolves and changes. But in terms of bisexuality, I will absolutely be bi until I die. Ooh, bi until I die. Pins, shirts, merch. Okay, merch coming soon.
We're taking pre-orders online already. Folks, we've got time for maybe one more question.
Is there anyone online, or do we see?
No, there are people online, but no questions
right,
online. So they're afraid. Okay. It's all right. No, so anyone else? All right. Well, in absence of any other questions,
Thank you.
I think we're going to let everybody come up and ask their questions in person.
Sure.
And get a copy of their book signed.
Awesome. Let me grab.
So Seminary Co-op has books for sale in the back. For those of you watching online, semcoop.com. And Zach will be up here signing.
Let me grab my fancy pens.
But first, let us
sorry.
thank you so much for sharing so much of yourself with us tonight.
Thank you. This is a lot of fun.
And thank you to all of you for coming and for joining us.
Oh, can I take a photo with everyone? Does everyone?